Case 623 by Danny Yu. Chapter 7. I cannot believe the gall of those British bastards. If they manage to expose us before we're ready, we might as well have prepared to spend another 60 years starting over. Hydra is fractured, Erpish. Hydra is stronger than it has ever been, Zola. He tossed a glare at the computer screen where the copy of Zola's processes resided. In another 10 years at the most, we'll be able to put your algorithm into effect. Our time is nearly here. 57% blood toxicity. For long moments, Tony couldn't even seem to move, wasn't convinced his legs would carry him, couldn't let go of the counter in front of him, or he'd fucking collapse. It was all happening way too fast. After months of keeping the poisoning mostly under control, of trying and fighting and downing more chlorophyll than any human being should ever reasonably have to, the levels had more than doubled in less than 2 weeks, as if some kind of balance had been tipped, and even his best efforts couldn't keep it down anymore. He sucked in a sharp breath, did his best to ignore the constant burning in his chest, the way his head throbbed and his throat hurt and even his teeth were starting to ache. He was running out of time so much faster than he thought he would. Not for the first time, he regretted ever deciding to revive the Stark Expo, packing his whole schedule so tight when all he should be doing was spending every last precious second with Jamie. Instead, he was in Monaco for a Grand Prix, and Jamie was hanging out with a couple of bodyguards back in the hotel room. What was he doing, throwing all this time away? A furious, hopeless kind of restlessness gripped him, made his skin crawl and his pulse race, and for a moment he wasn't sure whether he was about to burst out sobbing or screaming, or if he could somehow find a way to contain it all. His hands shook where he was clutching the counter. He needed to do something, needed to... fuck even knew what. He could go to the hotel room, grab Jamie, and go home. Except he couldn't. He couldn't be with Jamie in this moment, no matter how badly he wanted to. He was too wound up. He'd frightened him, and that was the absolute last thing he wanted. Baby's memories were all wonky and strange, and Tony didn't want to risk creating a situation where Jamie's only memory of him was a frightening one. And fuck, he was just barely a year old. It would be a miracle if he remembered Tony at all. At least hopefully Tony had left enough of a positive data trail by now that the memories Jamie would undoubtedly make up for himself wouldn't be all bad. Tony glanced at the toxicity meter again, squeezed his eyes shut for a long moment. Perhaps he'd left enough for Jamie to be proud of him. He supposed one good thing was that a dead dad was less likely to be the utterly uncle nuisance to a future teenager than a living one. He couldn't explain the strange recklessness that shot through him then, at the thought that all that really mattered at this point was what he left behind. Nothing else mattered, only what parts of himself he could leave for Jamie to find, and what he could make for himself in these last few days, weeks, if he was uncommonly lucky. And right now, suddenly, with all this weighing on him, he needed to feel alive, needed to recharge so he could go back up to that hotel room and be the father Jamie deserved for a little while longer. Without bidding, his mind flashed to the race car that literally had his name all over it. He glanced up, met his own eyes in the mirror. Got any other bad ideas? Palladium concentration, 89%. Do you know which watch you'd like to wear tonight, Mr. Stark? Rushman was asking, the sound of her stiletto surprisingly soft on the marble floor. Tony quickly pulled his shirt together to hide the rash, glanced out at the last bit of twilight still visible through the windows. His birthday. His last one. He'd be surprised if he survived for Jamie's, which they'd estimated to be 5 days from now. Everything was falling apart spectacularly. He had Stern so far up his ass he could taste it, and apparently Howard had left behind a blood feud he hadn't seen fit to inform Tony of. Tony had tried to tell Pepper what was going on, but he couldn't get the words past his lips, as if the action of saying things out loud to another human being would make him drop dead then and there. He had wanted so badly to just take Jamie and go to one of his villas in Europe, hide away from everything and let the rest of the world deal with its own crap. Just be happy for a moment. Give Jamie a last few weeks of having a family. He hadn't. However much he might sometimes hate it, he did have responsibilities to more than just his son, most of them of his own making. He needed to at least attempt to get his affairs in order, though it was looking less and less likely that he'd manage it. Fuck all, he hadn't even managed to tell Rhodey, and Rhodey was the one who'd be left holding his friend's orphan baby. Tony took a breath, forced himself back under control. He adjusted his shirt, buttoned it up, began to make himself somewhat presentable. "I'll give them a look," he said. Rushman put down the box and judging by the sound of it, set about finishing the martini Tony had started in a fit of melancholy a few minutes ago.
"We should cancel the party, huh?"
Tony said, turning towards her. "Probably," she said, the glass cradled delicately in her hands.
"Yeah," Tony said, walking towards her. "'Cause it's,
ill-timed," she supplies.
"Right, sends the wrong message,"
Tony said, taking the glass out of her hands. "Inappropriate," she said. Tony took a sip, let the liquor roll around in his mouth. He didn't have much of a taste for it anymore. Hadn't really indulged since Afghanistan, since Jamie. Was something about the finality of all this... Fuck, he didn't even know. Didn't feel like he had his head on straight anymore, which, according to Jarvis, was just another fucking symptom. "Is that dirty enough for you?" Rushman asked, looking up at him with big eyes and pretty features, and a year ago, Tony would have been all over that, but he was barely feeling the faintest stirrings of attraction right now. He'd go celibate for the rest of his damn life if it could buy him another couple of months with Jamie. Another couple of weeks.
"Gold face, brown band,"
Tony said, deliberately turning towards the watch case.
"The Jaeger, I'll give that a look. Bring them over here."
He placed the glass down on the coffee table, lowered himself into the recliner as Rushman brought over the watches.
"I'll take that," he said. "Why don't you,
She sat down on the armrest, slowly flicked her hair out of her face, and Tony wasn't sure what to make of the signals she was giving off.
Might have found something funny in it once upon a time, or something actually seductive, but he hadn't been amused in a while, and he didn't have the free bandwidth to give a fuck about sex. Thankfully, all she did next was lean in and start to dab makeup on the bruises still left over from Monaco. And Tony let out a breath of relief, felt himself relax the tiniest bit. "I gotta say," he concluded, too tired to go beating around the bush and keep having to guess at what was going on behind her impassive face. "It's hard to get a read on you. Where are you from?"
"Legal,"
she said, which should have probably been kind of annoying. Tony generally didn't appreciate it when people played dumb, but right now he was in the odd kind of mood that made it easier to tolerate other people being deadpan and closed off. God knew he had plenty of secrets of his own.
Maybe that, the fact that something that would have normally annoyed him somehow made him feel a brief moment of connectedness, was what made him keep talking when he could just as well have kept quiet and let her shut down the conversation the way she'd clearly tried to.
"Can I ask you a question, hypothetically?"
She leaned back, snapped the makeup box shut.
"Bit odd,"
he said. He reached up, rubbed at his eyes with a grimace. Somehow, despite still speaking, he couldn't stand the thought of what would happen if she got a good read on his face.
"If this was your last birthday party you were ever going to have, how would you celebrate it?"
Words out, he fell back on slightly safer ground, dropped his hand, and peered up at her. Her gaze flickered for a moment before her face settled into a soft smile that actually looked pretty genuine. "I'd do whatever I wanted to." Her gaze flickered down again for a moment before catching his once more. "With whoever I wanted to do it with."
Tony watched as she got up, walked towards the door. Then he sighed. "Call off the party, please. Not Pepper and Rhodey. And tell Happy to come on up. Cancel the caterers, order us some pizza. Please?"
Something flickered over her face when she looked back over her shoulder at him, there and gone again, too fast for Tony to get a good read. "Of course, Mr. Stark."
"That was the strangest birthday party you've ever thrown me," Rhodey said when Tony walked back out into the living room after tucking Jamie into bed in the nursery. Pepper and Happy were nowhere to be found, and Rhodey was already finished clearing up, so Tony grabbed a beer from the fridge and plopped into the couch with a muted groan. What's so wrong about watching a good movie with a few friends and eating enough pizza to get a grease hangover? Tony asked, screwing the lid off the beer and taking a long swallow. Rhodey shrugged, dropping down next to him. "Nothing," he said. "Aside from maybe the grease hangover. Just not how you usually roll." Tony returned the shrug. "Wouldn't have been appropriate with everything that's going on right now," he said. Rhodey cocked an eyebrow. "Once upon a time, that would have just made you that much more eager to make a scene." "Once upon a time, I didn't have a kid in the house," Tony said. The smile Rhodey flashed him was damn near gentle. Then he ruined it by leaning in, gripping Tony by the scruff of the neck, and ruffling up his hair hard enough that he was probably making static electricity. For a moment, Tony was 14 again and deliriously happy and having finally made a friend his dad hadn't had to pay at the thought that a cool dude 5 years his senior actually wanted to hang out with him. The remnants of that boy was what made him go with Rhodey's tug and lean his head on his friend's shoulder. "I'm so fucking proud of you, Tones," Rhodey said, voice soft. "I'm not sure you even realize how far you've come. So damn proud." Tony had to swallow hard around the lump in his throat to keep the sudden tears at bay. "I need you to do 2 things for me," he said. Rhodey's arm wrapped around Tony's shoulders and gave him a squeeze. "Anything!" Tony snorted. "You might want to hear me out first," he said. "These aren't little things." "When are they ever with you?" Rhodey asked. Tony let out a breath, pulled it carefully back in. He honestly wasn't sure whether it was the reactor or the palladium or pure emotion that made his chest hurt right in that moment. Probably all of the above. "I need you to take care of Stern in the military for me," he said. "I'm giving you a suit. You personally, not them. You're the only one who pilots it. I know you trust them, but let that get mass-produced and then the whole world will have suits. And that's not a world I want Jamie to grow up in. So, but I trust you. And you can use it for what you want to. Run missions for them, take out the rest of the 10 rings, rid the world of Stark weapons. That would be an absolute dream. Just, point is, they don't trust me, but they trust you. I trust you. And I want you to have it." Rhodey didn't say a word for so long that Tony began to get worried. What if this was the whole conflict of loyalties thing playing up again, like back at the hearing? What if Rhodey insisted that he'd have to hand it over, that... "Of course," Rhodey said finally, cutting off Tony's train of thought and settling his worries all in one go. He pulled back a little, just enough to look Tony in the eye without getting too close. "Just, are you sure? All that I am Iron Man stuff and everything?" "Well, you can use another name if you want," Tony said. "Or you can use Iron Man. Your choice, really." Tony's brow furrowed. "Tony, what the hell is going on right now?" Tony shook his head. "Give me a moment," he said. One more thing, Rhodey." Rhodey nodded, but the concern didn't leave his gaze. "Take care of Jamie," Tony asked. His voice cracked in the middle, and he had to stop for a moment to get it back under control. "Really take care of him. Don't give him up to some family who just wants to use him. I know you'll probably need a nanny or something, busy man and all that, and I know you'll vet them. Pepper will help you, but just be there for him. Don't let him feel alone. Don't..." He had to stop again, reach up and run a hand over his eyes because he was crying now, and he hated that. But he couldn't seem to get it under control, as if all these months of build-up were crashing down on him all at once. "I felt so alone all the time until I met you. Don't let him feel like that. And tell him the good stories, will you? None of the bad ones, not until he's big enough. Give him that. Please?" Rhodey frowned. "Tony, you know I love that kid like a nephew. Of course I'm going to be there for him, but you're starting to sound like you won't? Tony?" Tony ran a hand over his face again, could barely find enough air to form the words. "I'm going to die," he finally said. "Soon. Real soon. So just..." Rhodey's eyes widened in horror, and somewhere by the door something dropped to the floor. Tony looked up, shocked, breathless, and saw Pepper standing there, hand over her mouth, eyes round. Her keys were on the floor, and Tony realized her bag was sitting on the far end of the couch, clearly forgotten earlier in the night. He was rooted to the spot, could only stare as the blood drained from her face as she turned around and rushed out of the house. By the time he had gathered himself enough to get to his feet and run after her, she was long gone. Rhodey grabbed him by the shoulders and steered him back to the couch. "I promise, Tony," he said, voice surprisingly steady, picking the conversation up from where they left it off. "I'll take care of him. But now, I want you to tell me what the hell is going on!" It was surprisingly easy to get the words out, and it was easier to breathe than it had been in days. He'd give Pepper time to cool down, talk to her in the morning. Most important thing was that Jamie had a good future ahead of him, whatever happened.